Thank you for joining me, ladies and gentlemen. And as you step in, make sure to hit that like button. It would really be appreciated. It also affects the algorithm. It draws more people to this broadcast. I really would appreciate it. And this is about my favorite Super Bowl of all time, the 1979 Super Bowl, but for the 1978 season, of course, Super Bowl 13 between the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Dallas Cowboys. And this was literally the brawl for it all, ladies and gentlemen. What I mean by that was this was the Super Bowl, which would determine which would be the team that would be the team of the 70s. If you remember, hey, Cheryl Burnett, I'm talking about good times. I mean, let's face it. You look at the Steelers now, they're searching for their fourth head coach in 56 years. Wow, that's crazy. As long as I've been alive, the Steelers have had only three head coaches. Chuck Noll, of course, who's the standard, Bill Cowher, and Mike Tomlin. And now we're going for number 4. And I tell you who I don't want as head coach. And if the Steelers, Cheryl Burnett, I'm going to go one step further. If the Steelers hire Mike McCarthy as their head coach, I might jump ship. They better never touch Mike McCarthy. You saw what he did in Dallas. He's not a Steeler, has no ties to the Steeler organization, no legacy to them. The only thing he did, he and Aaron Rodgers kept us from winning a Super Bowl. Well, actually, Rashard Mendenhall did that, but I digress. But again, that is not the guy that you want as a head coach, especially after the legacy of the 3 men before. No. I know you agree with me on that. It better not be Mike McCarthy. Now, if you tell me it's Brian Flores, it makes sense. Even if you give me the LA Rams coaching tree, that's fine. It better not be Mike McCarthy. If it's Mike McCarthy, I might have to get a second team. I'll never leave the Steelers, but I'll look for a second team to root for. No way. Well, Brian Flores is a black head coach, Cheryl Burnett, but Brian Flores is a proven head coach. First of all, if the Miami Dolphins had to listen to Brian Flores, because he was right about Tua, and he also served on the staff, on the coaching staff with Tomlin. So I would love to have Brian Flores as a head coach for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, I would love to have I want him to be a good coach. I don't want Marvin Lewis. And that's what essentially Tomlin became after the last few years. I love DeMeco Ryans, but you know he's not available. DeMeco Ryans is going absolutely nowhere. You know it and I know it. But yeah, listen, and DeMeco Ryans, as you can tell, he and Tomlin are very close. I don't know if you realize that or not. He and Tomlin are very close. I tell you what, if DeMeco Ryans jumped ship to go to the Steelers, I'm not looking at, you know what, Cheryl Burnett, he just killed the whole argument with that. I ain't looking at that man. Oh gosh, man. I tell you, I can't argue that one. But anyway, let me get back to Super Bowl 13. I'm not mad at you. I was all of 9 years old when the Super Bowl came out. But it helped define. Listen, I was a Steeler fan before that because, of course, and you see the avatar there. Those are the 3 most important offensive guys in Pittsburgh Steeler history. And I want somebody to please try to argue who was more important to the history of the Pittsburgh Steelers on the offensive side. We know about the defense. The steel curtain was the steel curtain. But those 3 guys right there And from left to right, Franco Harris, you could make the point that he was the most important one, because from 1972 to, I'll say, about the 78 season, from 1972 to 1977, the Steeler offense revolved around Franco Harris. It was Franco left, Franco right, Terry Bradshaw play action, Lynn Swann bail me out. It was. And before anybody starts saying, but John Stallworth was better, shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. And I love John Stallworth. John Stallworth had the longer career. He ended up getting more receptions than Swann, but he also played 5 more seasons than Lynn Swann. Franco was the man. It wasn't even close. Now, he and Rocky Bleier ran for 1,000 yards each in 1976, and Chuck Noll will argue that 76 team was the best of the Steeler teams, and they didn't even win the Super Bowl. But a lot of injuries took place. 77 was a lost year for the Steelers. A lot of people held out. There was a lot of turmoil. And the 78 season was a very important season for not just the Pittsburgh Steelers, but for the National Football League. There were a lot of rules that were put in place, and Don Shula even admitted it years later, that were put in place to stop the Pittsburgh Steelers. And 2 in particular, ironically, they didn't stop the Pittsburgh Steelers, they made the Steelers better. The first rule was the Mel Blount rule. And it's called that because Mel Blount, who's a Hall of Famer, yet another Hall of Famer, and part of the great defense that became the Steel Curtain. And let me preface this by saying the original Steel Curtain defense were just 4 guys, and that was the defensive line, because the Steelers played a 4-3 defense. That's the real Steel Curtain. The Steel Curtain really consisted of course, the centerpiece, Mean Joe Green, L.C. Greenwood, who should be in the Hall of Fame, and it's a joke that he's not in. And as long as L.C. Greenwood is not in the Hall of Fame, the NFL Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio remains a joke. Let me put that there too. Dwight Mad Dog White and Ernie Holmes. Now, by 1978, Ernie Holmes was gone. He was gone, traded to the Kansas City Chiefs. Steve Furness became the defensive tackle that took his place. And they didn't miss a beat. Now, by 78, the defense was still very good. It wasn't as dominant as it was from 1974 to 1977. It was still a great defense. Now, the creek started coming in 1979, even though the Steelers won their 4th and final Super Bowl of that era and made themselves the team of the decade. And dare I say it, the greatest Super Bowl dynasty of all time. Yeah, that includes New England. First of all, that New England dynasty has a whole different ball game. And God bless Tom Brady and that team, and Belichick and Kraft. But that's a watered down NFL. The reason why the Pittsburgh Steelers, and this is the best Super Bowl ever played, and this is the best team of all time. And I tell you, I go back and forth between the 75 Pittsburgh Steelers and the 78 Pittsburgh Steelers. And I don't want to hear anything about the Chicago Bears. Well, they did win. Hold on. We did win in 2005, and we won in 2008. So we did win 6, but it wasn't the same core team. They got old. Remember, in the 70s, it was a little bit different. But to win 4 championships in 6 years, I don't think we'll ever see that again, Cheryl Burnett. And I'm going to be honest, maybe as a Steeler fan, we are spoiled because we were spoiled by those 70 Steelers. Now, as I mentioned, the Mel Blount rule took into effect. Now, those were different teams. In fact, if you notice, it was won by Cap. That's why Chuck Noll's the standard. Chuck Noll won 4 championships, 4-0, where both Tomlin and Cowher combined are 2-2. And again, and the reason that Chuck Noll is the standard is not just because that he won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years with the greatest talent ever assembled. And that's according to head coaching legend and NFL Hall of Famer in his own right, Bill Walsh, who was pretty damn good in these Super Bowls himself. He was 3-0. Okay. And you can make a case that Bill Walsh, if you want to say that he was a better coach than Chuck Noll, I'll say yes and I'll say no. He was a better offensive coach than Chuck Noll, but Chuck Noll built this team from the ground up. And when Chuck Noll had the talent, he won with it. You talk about maximizing talent, nobody did that better than Chuck Noll did. I understand it's the Vince Lombardi trophy, and rightfully so, because the Green Bay Packers were the standard in the 60s. And Lombardi's legacy is great. If you want to say that Lombardi's a better coach than Noll, I will not disagree with you, and I might co-sign that because he had turned around the Redskins. Now, he didn't get a chance to fulfill his turnaround with the Redskins because he passed away from cancer. But what Noll did, transforming the Steelers, which were the losing franchise of decades. The Steelers were so bad in the 50s and 60s. I mean, they probably had to pay you to watch them. That's how bad they were. But Chuck Noll came through in 1969, ironically, the year I was born. And it took a while for them to get to championship caliber. But it started with Mean Joe Green, the very first draft pick. Then Bradshaw, Blunt. I mean, you could see the roster taking shape. And in 1974, the greatest influx of talent of all time, the Pittsburgh Steelers NFL draft in 1974 is the greatest draft of all time. It's not even close. Look at the Hall of Famers that they chose. And on top of that, they got gifted a free agent who became a Hall of Famer, and it took him entirely too long to get there, named Donnie Shell. And ironically, Donnie Shell had many of his best years after the Steel Curtain defense. Mean Joe Green is the standard. Mean Joe Green is the Steelers. Mean Joe Green is the most important Steeler of all time. And it's not even close. Not even close. He was more important than Bradshaw. I won't say he was more important than Franco, because as Mean Joe Green himself said, there was before Franco and after Franco. And that's why Franco Harris will always be the Pittsburgh Steelers standard at running back. Now, Le'Veon Bell had a chance to be the number 1 running back in Steelers history, and his greed and his narcissism got him run out of Pittsburgh. Now, did he deserve to get paid? Yes. But it turned out the Steeler offer was better than the Jet offer. And he went for the Jets, and his career went south with it. Then he tried to hang around and get a Super Bowl with the Chiefs. That didn't work out well for him either. But I digress. And anybody that says, oh, Jerome Bettis was better than Franco Harris, they need to shut the F up and keep it moving. I love the bus. He was not Franco Harris. Yeah, the commercial, of course. In fact, that Mean Joe Green commercial is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame and in the Commercial Hall of Fame. That's how huge an impact Mean Joe Green's commercial had. And it also made him look like a very nice, well, he was a nice, I mean, he is a nice guy. I don't want to say was, I'm sorry. In fact, Mean Joe Green is the last surviving member of the original Steel Curtain. Mean Joe Green is 78 years old. God bless him. But again, when you look at those guys that are being shown here in the avatar, Franco Harris, Lynn Swann, Terry Bradshaw. Lynn Swann is the greatest receiver in Pittsburgh Steelers history. And I know there's going to be a lot of guys that are going to, because they're young, they never saw Lynn Swann. They'll look at Lynn Swann's numbers and they'll say, Lynn Swann's numbers, he averaged 50 yards and 5 catches a game. He would get good. Well, let me tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. Terry Bradshaw's numbers were dreadful, but it was a different game back then. And Terry Bradshaw, this is why Terry Bradshaw gets the nod over Ben Roethlisberger to me. Not just the fact that Terry won 4 Super Bowls, not the fact that he won the MVP that year, something that Ben Roethlisberger never even sniffed, okay? And of course, Terry Bradshaw didn't grape anybody either, or wasn't accused of graping anybody, but I digress. Terry Bradshaw did the most important thing that a quarterback does, well, used to do anyway. That's the sad part about the NFL now, and that's why the NFL is hard to watch. Terry Bradshaw was the last quarterback, and he says it with pride, and rightfully so. He was the last quarterback to call his own plays. Back in the day, the essence of being an NFL quarterback was calling your own plays. Now they're babied by an offensive coordinator. They have to look on their little wristband. It's a joke. Terry Bradshaw catered to the team. Instead of saying, you know what, I can put it up 30 times and get 400 yards and 5 touchdowns and 2 picks. Let me do what's best for the Pittsburgh Steelers and hand it off to Franco Harris. That's what Terry Bradshaw did. That's why Terry Bradshaw is the man. And that's why, and he also didn't throw his teammates under the bus either. Like Big Ben did and does and continues to do. And as much as he hated Chuck Noll, and let's face it, he and Chuck Noll hated each other. And that was common knowledge. But he even acknowledged that he wouldn't have been the football player that he was without Chuck Noll. Chuck Noll wasn't there to babysit Terry Bradshaw. Chuck Noll was there to win football games. And he even admitted that Chuck Noll was a nice man. He was a good man. He was a God-fearing man. Chuck Noll gave all the credit to the players. He never looked for credit himself. He wasn't fist pumping. He wasn't all about me. He wasn't jutting the jaw like Cowher. And Tomlin had a little bit of that too, where it became about him a little bit. But to be fair, both Cowher and Tomlin also gave the players their credit. But Chuck Noll was the antithesis of those guys. Chuck Noll was the guy who said, listen, I played a small part in it, knowing he didn't. It was his calmness in the storm that made him the great coach that he was. He wasn't a rah-rah coach because, as he would tell you, I'd rather cut you than anything else. If I have to motivate you, you will not be a Pittsburgh Steeler long. His words, not mine. That's why Terry Bradshaw is the number 1 quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers and not Big Ben. And I know Big Ben has all the numbers, all the years. Simple. Terry called his own plays. 4 beats 2. Very simple. When Swann retired, he had more receptions and touchdowns than John Stallworth. He was the number 1 receiver in Pittsburgh Steelers history. And Lynn Swann only played 8.5 seasons. Swann's last season in Pittsburgh was a strike-shortened 1982 season where he played all of 2 games. And he made, I think, 2 catches all year long. His numbers were a little skewed. And Bradshaw had actually his best seasons after the championship teams. In fact, Bradshaw's last full season was also the strike-shortened season. Yep, see there? You agree. Bradshaw led the league in touchdowns that year. Ironically, Swann's final year, and he wasn't even his best. Now, by 1979, Stallworth became the better receiver. I'll give you that. But 6 of the 9 years, Swann was the better receiver, and it wasn't even close. Swann went to the Hall of Fame first. And I tell you what, if Swann doesn't advocate for Stallworth, he might not have got in. But Swann did the right thing because John Stallworth was, I don't want to say a notch below Swann. Oh, shit, he was a notch below Swann. Hell, John Stallworth's kid said his favorite receiver was Lynn Swann. Shoot, I mean, damn, what do you want? And I'm not saying that John Stallworth was chopped liver. He wasn't. John Stallworth is the second greatest receiver in Pittsburgh Steelers history. It just so happens that Lynn Swann's the best. He's better than Antonio Brown. Now, see, that's the thing. Antonio Brown should have been the number. See, that is why me and Cheryl Burnett are probably so frustrated with the Steelers. Because the Killer Bees, now the Killer Bees didn't have the defense that Bradshaw, Swann, and Harris had. They didn't. But they certainly had the talent offensively. And they should have been the best in Pittsburgh Steelers history. But those 3 guys that we're looking at right now in that avatar will not be touched unless you're going to think of a Steeler team. If the Steelers teams of the 2020s are going to win 5 Super Bowls in 7 years, these guys will always be the standard. And the most disappointing one was Antonio Brown, because Antonio Brown was the best receiver I have ever seen outside of Lynn Swann and John Stallworth. Antonio Brown, what we saw from him from 2014 to 2018, my gosh. He was the best wide receiver in pro football. And there have only been 2 wide receivers in the Steeler organization where they've been acknowledged as the best in the business. Antonio Brown and Lynn Swann, that man right there. Lynn Swann's prime was from 1975 to 1978. In fact, in 1978, he was first team All-Pro. Antonio Brown, he ain't sitting up in prison. When you look at Lynn Swann and John Stallworth, those are the model of how you act as a Pittsburgh Steeler. You look at Lynn Swann and John Stallworth today, how they've conducted themselves, how they even look. Do you know that John Stallworth is a minority owner in the Pittsburgh Steelers? Because he is. Google that when you get a chance. John Stallworth has had a magnificent second act outside of football. Hey, Misunderstood, how are you? You know, I'm talking about one of my favorite topics, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And not only the Pittsburgh Steelers, the greatest of the Pittsburgh Steelers, the 1978 Pittsburgh Steelers, the greatest team in NFL history, the greatest team in Super Bowl history. And that includes your sorry 85 Bears. Yeah, I said it. In fact, the 1985 Chicago Bears couldn't hold a candle to the 78 Pittsburgh Steelers. And I'll break that down a little bit as to why. Look at there is no professionalism now. When you hear Lynn Swann talk, when you hear John Stallworth talk, when you hear Mel Blount talk, see, this is why those Steelers are special. When Lynn Swann scored a touchdown, he celebrated modestly. In fact, the last modest football player you could make a case was Barry Sanders, because he would just hand the ball off to the referee like he's been there before. Because let's face it, a lot of these guys it's all about me. And I understand prime time Deion Sanders, and listen, that's not a knock on him. And he paid the cost to be the boss, because nobody had a better work ethic than Deion Sanders. That never gets brought up, by the way. But those guys, the Steelers, carried themselves different. And I understand that Terry Bradshaw is a bit of a loose cannon. And Terry Bradshaw sometimes drives me crazy. But Terry Bradshaw is brutally honest, and he was brutally honest about himself and how he suffered from depression. And I don't know how many countless lives that he saved talking about his battle with depression. We're talking about an MVP in Terry Bradshaw, a Hall of Famer, a first ballot Hall of Famer. Terry Bradshaw was the first number one draft pick of a quarterback who became an NFL Hall of Famer. And he struggled. He talked about his struggles while he was playing for the Steelers, his struggles with his family, his marriages. So I do have again, he drives me crazy. But those guys rallied around Bradshaw, and you see how hard they played with him and for him. You look at Mel Blount, the way he's taking care of himself. Look at the guys who are still around from those Steeler teams, and the way look at Rocky Bleier. Rocky Bleier was the epitome of what it was to be a Pittsburgh Steeler. Came home from Vietnam, all beat up and bruised. Hit the gym twice a day. Mean Joe Green said that pound for pound, Rocky was the toughest guy on the team. And they saw how bruised up with his Purple Heart, and he's in the weight room every day. If Rocky Bleier with that beat up body, war-torn, ravaged body, could hit the weight room and come in for practice, there was no way the other Steelers were not going to be there. And you talk about guys who galvanized around a guy, those Steelers revere, and it doesn't matter white, black, blue, or yellow, all those guys revere Rocky Bleier, revere him. No one revered him more than Franco before he passed away. Franco Harris loved Rocky Bleier. Rocky Bleier was probably the most respected guy on the team. And I don't think he made one Pro Bowl. Even though when you look at the modern day, it's so funny. If you look at the modern day prototype fullback, Rocky Bleier should be in the Hall of Fame. But then you'll get the Steeler bias. Oh, there's too many Steelers in the Hall of Fame as it is. Well, suck it up, Buttercup. We were that good. Not my problem that y'all suck. Get over it. Again, Mr. Walsh. And when I say Mr. Walsh, the great Bill Walsh, the architect of the San Francisco dynasty of the 80s, which was loosely built on the Steelers, by the way, and that's going to be another live stream. Because Eddie DeBartolo, the original owner of the San Francisco 49ers during that dynasty, he's from Pittsburgh, and he modeled his franchise after the 70s Steelers. Now, I didn't even talk about the game as of yet. And the Steelers ended up winning that game 35-31. That was the first rematch of a prior Super Bowl. Remember, they played each other in Super Bowl 10. That was the Lynn Swann Master Class, where he was the first wide receiver to win MVP. And you could have made a case that he could have won it in this game also. Now, Stallworth was brilliant too. He had 3 catches, but for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns. Stallworth was outstanding. But he had severe cramps and could not play in the second half. And Lynn Swann was already double teamed. That's why Stallworth was able to get open the way he did. So they were able to rotate another guy to Swann. And that was also the reason why the game was as close as it was. Tom Landry and the Dallas Cowboys had won the Super Bowl the year prior. The Cowboys had won a Super Bowl early in the 70s. And of course, the Steelers had won back-to-back Super Bowls. So this game was to decide who was going to be the team of the decade. Was it going to be the Pittsburgh Steelers with the terrible towels and the steel curtain? Or was it going to be so-called America's team, the Dallas Cowboys, with that sickening star on their helmets? Now, as much as I couldn't stand the Cowboys and still can't stand them, I have the utmost respect for that franchise. Tom Landry was every bit as stoic as Chuck Noll. Him with the 10-gallon hat over there in the sideline and the suit. Terry Bradshaw was a great quarterback. I used to think that Roger Staubach was a better quarterback than Terry Bradshaw. He was a more accurate quarterback than Bradshaw. I'll give you that. But he wasn't better. Bradshaw was better. And I'm going to tell you, the reason why Bradshaw called his own plays, I did not know that Roger Staubach had to rely on Tom Landry to call his plays. That takes away from him. I'm sorry. And he had receivers, because Drew Pearson's a Hall of Famer. That took entirely too long. Tony Hill's not. I understand why he's not in the Hall of Fame. Billy Joe Dupree, you can make a case for. And of course, there's Tony Dorsett, who's from Pittsburgh, played his college ball with Pitt, Heisman Trophy winner. Emmitt Smith is the all-time leading rusher in the NFL. Tony Dorsett was the better running back. Emmitt Smith was the better football player. Those who know the sport understand exactly what I'm talking about. And Tony Dorsett was smooth, man. And I tell you what, Tony Dorsett almost ran for 100 yards against the steel curtain. No small feat. In fact, you can make a case that Tom Landry messed up the game by not going to Tony Dorsett enough. But Tony Dorsett, those holes that were there in the first half were not there in the second half. The Steelers did adjust to Dorsett in the second half of the game. But Landry abandoned the run much too early. That game will also be remembered for Jackie Smith's drop in the end zone. And of course, we remember Vern Lundquist saying that he was the sickest man in America. They'll play that every so often, because let's face it, every time around the Super Bowl, you're going to see a bunch of things from Super Bowl 13 and Super Bowl 10, for that matter. You're going to see the mess Jackie Smith drop. You're going to see Roger Staubach's reaction, because he was like, oh, he was bad. And he just couldn't hide it. And of course, you're going to see the catches by Stallworth, the Rocky Bleier catch, and the common denominator of them all. And as I guess you guys can tell, my two favorite football players of all time are Mean Joe Green and Lynn Swann. Lynn Swann is directly responsible for both Super Bowl victories against the Dallas Cowboys. As I mentioned, in Super Bowl 10, he gave you a master class on how to play the wide receiver position. You'll see it every Super Bowl Sunday. You're going to see Lynn Swann's catches, and rightfully so. The catch that sealed the deal in Super Bowl 13, he made look simple. Lynn Swann jumped in the air like Michael Jordan, literally. And he was only 5'9" on a good day. No one took more punishment than Lynn Swann did. Nobody. Hence why he only played 8.5 seasons. And as soon as Lynn Swann's career was over, he became a game show host. And later he would be on the sidelines in the college football games, and he lasted there for about 30 some odd years. And he later became the athletic director at USC, even though he did not last long there. And he also ran for governor. On the Republican side, he ran for governor of Pennsylvania, where he lost. Maybe Pennsylvania would be in a better position if they had went with Swann. Who knows? But again, I have a lot of respect for the Cowboys. I mentioned of course, Tony Dorsett, of course, Roger Staubach, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the doomsday Dallas defense of Harvey Martin, Randy White, and Hollywood Henderson, who gave Terry Bradshaw grief, of course. Remember the famous Terry Bradshaw couldn't spell cat if you gave him the C and the T. But of course, Terry, who became the MVP of that game, and rightfully so, he said, asked Hollywood, can he spell MVP? And that was a great retort. Ironically, Hollywood Henderson would get cut by the Cowboys. He had his own issues with drug abuse, but he got himself clean, became a drug counselor, and he hit the lottery for, I believe, about $60 million. And Hollywood Henderson is straight. And he's been clean for about 30 some odd years, and then continues to help others. And in fact, Hollywood Henderson was interviewed by Bradshaw later on, many years later, and they became very, very cool. And that tends to happen, in the heat of battle, totally different. And of course, different times, different eras. But yeah, though both of those teams were great. The Cowboys were Super Bowl champions a year prior, beating the Denver Broncos and ex-teammate Craig Morton. I mean, they both raced the Denver Broncos. And a lot of people thought that Dallas was going to beat the Steelers. But the Steelers won it 35-31, and they became the team of the decade. Next year, the Steelers would win their 4th Super Bowl, and they wouldn't get one for the thumb for another 30 some odd years. And I lived those 30 some odd years, let me tell you. Steelers beat the Rams in Pasadena. That was pretty much a home game for the Rams, which is funny because there were more Steeler fans than Rams fans. The Steeler fans always traveled well. They gave Terry Bradshaw the MVP of Super Bowl 14. Now, I'm not going to argue Super Bowl 13, even though you could have gave it to Swann or Stallworth. But the fact that Bradshaw threw for over 300 yards and 4 touchdowns to only 1 interception, Bradshaw deserved the MVP. Super Bowl 14, which was funny because Swann looked like he was going to win the MVP, but he got hurt early in the third quarter. He got a concussion and was knocked out of the game. Little did we know that would be the last time that Lynn Swann would be in a playoff game. John Stallworth deserved to be the MVP of that game. The fact that he wasn't remains a joke. Without Stallworth, the Steelers do not win that game against the Rams. And a great defense. The Rams were a great team. They were not a great team that year. They were 9-7 and happened to sneak into the playoffs. But the Rams of the 70s had very formidable defenses. They had always won the NFC West. They always gave people fits. The only 2 teams that used to stand in their way were the Cowboys and, of course, the Minnesota Vikings. So it was only fitting, really, that the team of the decade had to go through the Rams to win their fourth and final Super Bowl. And it was only fitting that they went through the Cowboys twice to affirm their supremacy as the team of the decade. Now, we all know the game has changed. I mean, it's more like John Madden NFL, the video game, than John Madden, the coach. In fact, he was still coaching the Raiders back then. Those guys, you won't see those guys ever again. As great as Ben Roethlisberger threw the football, Terry Bradshaw threw a bomb like nobody else. The only guy who I could think of throwing a better deep ball was Warren Moon. And he didn't have Swan and Stallworth. Franco Harris is the immaculate reception, but he's a lot more than that. Again, Mean Joe Green said it best. There was the Steelers before Franco, and there was the Steelers after Franco. Before Franco, we didn't win ish, and after Franco, we didn't win ish. And he was right. Speaking of Mean Joe Green, he was the guy who was supposed to be the next Steeler coach after Doe retired in 1991, but the Steelers went outside of the organization and got Bill Cowher. It looks like the Steelers are going to go outside the organization here. I don't know whether it's going to be Flores or whether the LA Rams coordinators. It better not be Mike McCarthy. It better not be. But that being said, the Steelers, even though they won it by the game wasn't always as close as the score was. A couple of onside kicks went Dallas way. And again, Stallworth was out. Listen, if Stallworth and Swan were both playing, this could have been an even bigger blowout. But all hail the Pittsburgh Steelers, the 1978 Pittsburgh Steelers, with the myriad of Hall of Famers on both sides of the ball, on both sides, on both teams, both coaches, both owners, so many Hall of Famers on one stage. Super Bowl 13, in my opinion, remains the best Super Bowl ever. And you know what, in the comments section, what do you guys think? Which one do you think is the greatest Super Bowl of all time? A lot of people think the Steelers Super Bowl, when they come back and win against the Arizona Cardinals, is the greatest one ever. I disagree with that because the Cardinals have maybe two Hall of Famers in Edgerrin James and, of course, Kurt Warner. No, three. I have to put Larry Fitzgerald there. Sorry, Larry. But they weren't a great team. That Steeler defense was great. We didn't know that it would be Tomlin's only Super Bowl. We thought Tomlin would give us at least two more, but I digress. I'm still salty. Yes, I am. But anyway, just leave your comments in the comment section. Let me know which Super Bowl that you think was the best. It doesn't have to be a Steelers Super Bowl. Oh, you don't know, honestly? I'm surprised you didn't say the Chicago Bears Super Bowl was the best one when they beat New England and they were the true monsters of the Midway. And listen, I know I'm having a little bit of fun at the Bears' expense, but they had a great defense in '85. But here's the difference in why the Steelers are better than the Bears. The '85 Chicago Bears went through quarterbacks like Phil Simms. Phil Simms is a borderline Hall of Famer. Of course, you're going to say that's good. But here's the difference. The teams that the '85 Bears went through. They went through the New York Giants of Phil Simms and Lawrence Taylor, which would win the following year. So they get a plus for that. They went through the Rams and Dieter Brock. That was the only year he played in the NFL, and they got him from the CFL. And people are asking, who's Dieter Brock? Exactly. That's my point. When they beat the New England Patriots in the Super Bowl, they went through Champagne Tony Eason. And the reason he's called Champagne Tony Eason is because he played his college ball in Illinois, which is Champaign, Illinois. You know about that. And Steve Grogan was the backup, and he was washed up by that. That's who they went through. The 78 Pittsburgh Steelers had to go through the Denver Broncos, which had went to the Super Bowl the year prior. They obliterated that team. Earl Campbell was the best running back in pro football at that time. And those Houston Oilers teams were formidable. They were great teams. And of course, to win the Super Bowl, you had to go through the most accurate quarterback in the NFL in Roger Staubach, Captain America himself. So when it comes down to level of competition, it's not even close. Steelers win. We don't even talk about who the Steelers had to go through in the entire decade. When you look at the Steelers, the steel curtain of the 70s, from 1974 to 1979. And the Chicago Bears get shortchanged because everybody thinks of the 85 Bears, that's the only time the defense was good. That's not the truth. The Chicago Bears had a great defense from 1983 to about 1987, 1988. But the difference was the Steelers won 4 Super Bowls at that time, and the Bears only won that one Super Bowl in 85. Now, a lot of that was because Jim McMahon took a terrible, cheap shot from Charles Toomey Martin in Green Bay, and that changed the course. Walter Payton got old. And let's face it, there was a disconnect once Buddy Ryan went to Philadelphia and became the Eagles head coach. They lost a lot of their fire there, even though it's crazy. The year after that, under Bill Tobin, they actually posted better numbers than they did under Buddy Ryan. But again, the quarterback play was not as good. Walter Payton would retire the following season. He had gotten old. And Mike Ditka was a good but not great coach. And of course, Noel is one of the top 5 coaches of all time. That's the difference between the Bears and the Steelers. And that's why the Steelers are the greatest team of all time. And that's why Super Bowl 13 was the best Super Bowl ever. I'd like to thank Cheryl Burnett, Misunderstood, all those in the clouds and all those in the bushes. Uncle Claude signing out, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe on the way out. Take care. Stay safe. And God bless.